These Warframe pistols shred absolutely everything. Of course, I'm talking about the Dual Toxocyst. However, even though they're some of the best sidearms in the entire game, there are some very important things that you need to know, or else you might lose out on a ton of damage potential. So, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna take an in-depth look at the Dual Toxocyst with multiple different builds. As always, big shout out to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now let's jump right into it. First off, the Dual Toxocyst itself comes from the infested lab in your clan's dojo. Here you can just replicate the blueprint and then build it in your own foundry. However, the Dual Toxocyst doesn't come alone, but there is of course also the Incarnon adapter, which you can get from the Steel Path version of the Deviri circuit whenever it happens to be in the rotation. Unfortunately though, as of making this video, the Dual Toxocyst Incarnon is not part of what Cavallero sells in his Incarnon market, so you really gotta wait for that Deviri rotation. But now, let's take a look at what the Dual Toxocyst even is and what you need to know if you use it in practice. First off, in its base form, the Dual Toxocyst is an akimbo sidearm that fires semi-automatic, relatively slow, and it has a ton of recoil. Taking a look at the stats, we see that we do have a very nice status performance, however the crit chance with just 5% is really pathetic, so it doesn't look all too good. However, the Dual Toxocyst does have a unique mechanic, and that's called Frenzy, which makes it that whenever you land a headshot, you get the Frenzy bonus for 3 seconds, which gives you plus 150% fire rate, which is very special because it is multiplicative to all other sources of fire rate, plus 100% ammo efficiency, minus 75% recoil, which is very nice given how high the recoil is at base, and 100% additional toxin damage. One important thing to note though about this toxin damage is that it is not a separate bonus, but instead it will combine into other elements. So for example, if you put heat onto your Dual Toxocyst and then you trigger the Frenzy bonus, this will combine with the heat and change your element into gas. However, we're of course not here for the base fire version of the Dual Toxocyst, but for the Incarnon mode, and that first and foremost is charged like any other Incarnon weapon. By getting headshots, you fill up the Incarnon meter, and just like with other Incarnon weapons, if you have more multi-shot, then this meter fills up even faster. So let's quickly talk about what happens when you turn these bad boys into their Incarnon form. First of all, you will get a significant stat boost in the form that now you're dealing 11% crit chance, but at a 3x multiplier, and the status chance is even higher, increased from 37 all the way up to 43%. That is a whole lot. In terms of their behavior, the Dual Toxocyst is now fully automatic. However, as you can also see in the background right here, it becomes very, very unprecise when you fire it in the Incarnon mode. But that's not all. In the Incarnon form, the Dual Toxocyst gets somewhat of an AoE capability, because if you hit an enemy, it will create multiple other bullets ricocheting off to nearby foes. But now that we're already talking about the Incarnon mode so much, how about we next get into which Incarnon evolutions are the best to choose. First of all, of course, Evolution 1 is what enables the Incarnon mode in the first place, nothing to choose here. In Evolution 2, we have two options which might seem relatively similar, but there is a big difference. First of all, we have plus 60% more base damage and a 33% direct damage bonus per status type affecting the target. This is basically a weaker version of Galvanized Shot, and I personally wouldn't recommend it. What I like to go for would be the other one, which only gives you 50 more base damage, however, it gives you 5% more multi-shot, stacking up to 20 times whenever you cast an ability. This does not have a cooldown, and the bonus stays up for the entire mission, so all you really need to do is spam a couple of abilities, and then you will have 100% extra multi-shot for the rest of the mission. Especially with the ricocheting pellets, this is very, very nice. Evolution 3, however, is a crystal clear affair. Go for negative 50% weapon recoil, because remember, the recoil is relatively high, and then the other two don't even apply to the Incarnon form, making Marksman's Hand right here the obvious choice. And then in the final evolution, Evolution 4, it becomes relatively interesting. See, in the past, it was crystal clear that you would go for 20% more base critical chance. That was obviously the best stat, going from 11 to 31%. However, in 2025, with the introduction of Secondary Innovate, it does become somewhat viable if you wanted to increase your AoE potential to also go for Ripper rounds that gives you 3 meters of punch through. Yes, you do miss out on the big crit chance bonus, but with Secondary Innovate, that's not all too bad, and if you wanted to have as much AoE potential as possible, then I think Ripper rounds is now more viable than ever. However, please do not go for Neurotoxin, because what you get here is 70% more toxin damage for 3 seconds on a headshot, and remember, you're already getting 100% more toxin damage on the Frenzy bonus, so this one right here is only a minor increase. However though, I should mention that in most cases, the 20% crit chance is still the best choice. And as always, if you could maybe leave a like for the video, that'd be super nice because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. But let's now get into the reason why you're all here. Let's talk about builds. And before we jump into the modding itself, I actually want to start out with the arcane selection because in 2025 we are so spoiled for options when it comes to secondary arcanes that there is a lot to talk about here. The first arcane that I want to go over would be Secondary Enervate. This one is really good on pistols that have a low base crit chance because it increases your crit chance by 10% with every hit that you land. Note that this crit chance increase is flat, giving it a very quick ramp up. As I said before, if you want to go for the evolution that gives you more punch through, I think in those cases, Secondary Innovate is a must to give you the crit chance that you need, because otherwise you wouldn't have it. However, if you don't want to go for the punch through and rather take the evolution that increases your base crit chance to 31%, then a very great option here would be Secondary Outburst, which increases your crit chance as well as crit damage by up to 240% each if you are at a 12x melee combo multiplier. If you want to go and crank your crit potential up to 11, or 12 in that case, you know what I mean, then Secondary Outburst is the optimal choice for you. Next, we have the standard evergreen options for more base damage, those being Secondary Deadhead, Secondary Merciless, or Cascadia Flare. And here, I would personally recommend going for Secondary Deadhead because not only does it give you up to 360% base damage, no, it also gives you another headshot damage multiplier, and it reduces your recoil by 50%, meaning if you chose the evolution that reduces recoil by 50%, you have now officially eliminated recoil from that weapon altogether. However, if you don't like to go for headshots, Secondary Merciless always works, and if you decide to mod heat on your Dual Toxocyst, then you might also consider Cascadia Flare, giving you up to 480% more base damage, so more base damage than Deadhead and Merciless. However, I personally would still prefer Deadhead because of the recoil reduction and the additional headshot bonus. But, and this is also another sort of favorite of mine, if you want to get the absolute most ridiculous base damage bonus possible, then what you could do here, and this is very viable, use Secondary Encumber, which makes it that whenever you trigger a status effect, and believe me, you're going to trigger a lot of them, you have a 24% chance to inflict a random different status effect on the same enemy. If you combine that with Galvanized Shot, that gives you up to 120% more base damage per individual status effect, then that means in this combination, you can get to over 1000% base damage bonus, meaning significantly higher than all the previous options mentioned. Just note though, you would have to stack a lot of different status effects on the enemy first for that bonus to go so high, meaning against weaker enemies, it's probably better to go with one of the base damage arcanes that I mentioned earlier. However, the Secondary Encumber Galvanized Shot combination scales much better into very high enemy levels, where your foes get so tanky that you actually manage to stack it up. And finally, another nice option that I wanted to mention would be Secondary Fortifier, which helps you shred away enemy overguard and also gives you survivability because it transfers the enemy overguard onto yourself. In most cases, this is probably not the optimal choice, but especially if you're going to high-level activities with a lot of Eximus units, like for example Temporal Archimedia, then Secondary Fortifier is definitely a viable option. Just one thing that I definitely have to mention here is, do not use Akimbo Slipshot. Yes, the Dual Toxocyst is an Akimbo pistol, but Incarnon weapons do not benefit from ammo efficiency, so this arcane does not do anything for you. But now that we know everything about arcanes, let's finally delve into the builds, and the first thing I want to showcase here is a standard elemental damage build. In this case right here, I go for corrosive against Grenier, and what effectively happens here is very simple. We go for Hornet Strike as well as Galvanized Diffusion for the base damage and the multi-shot part. Our crit chance and crit damage comes from Prime Pistol Gambit and Prime Target Cracker. However, if you do not own Prime Pistol Gambit, then I would recommend going Creeping Bullseye instead. Yes, it has a little bit more crit chance than Prime Pistol Gambit, but I think the sacrifice in fire rate is not really worth it here. If you don't have Prime Pistol Gambit though, sure, use this one here over normal Pistol Gambit. However, in the case of Prime Target Cracker, which gives you 110% crit damage, you really want to have the Prime one and not the normal one because that only gives you 60%, a significantly lower value, and especially if you use Secondary Outburst for the crit chance and crit damage, if you don't have the Prime here, it might be worth it to just drop it altogether since you're getting so much crit damage out of this one anyway. Up next, of course, we have our elemental damage, where I went corrosive against Grenier with Pistol Pestilence as well as Primed Convulsion. However, you could drop Pistol Pestilence for literally anything else, maybe Galvanized Shot for even more status chance and damage, because remember, the Toxin bonus from your Frenzy effect here combines with modded elements, meaning with this alone you already have the Toxin, so you wouldn't necessarily need the Toxin from here to get your corrosive. Finally though, I went for a Grenier faction damage mod, pretty self-explanatory, and then I also went for Lethal Torrent because I just feel more comfortable with that extra bit of fire rate as well as multi-shot. In the Exilus, you basically have two different options. Either you go for Steady Hands to reduce your recoil down to 0. This is very nice if you don't have secondary deadheads to eliminate the recoil for you. But I personally prefer targeting Subsystem because it increases your accuracy, and remember, in the Incarnon form, this thing sprays like crazy. This next build right here is meant to go with Secondary Encumber as your secondary arcane. At base it works relatively similar, Galvanized Diffusion for the multi-shot. Now instead of Hornet Strike we go for Galvanized Shot because this will scale our base damage up so crazy with Secondary Encumber, like I previously mentioned. Then again, Prime Pistol Gambit, Prime Target Cracker, same situation as before. This here also is an elemental damage build against Grenier, but here I dropped the Toxin mod for more fire rate, because, as I said, the Toxin bonus from the effect will combine with Prime Convulsion anyway, so we do get a corrosive either way. However, if you didn't want to go for even more fire rate, you could also use Galvanized Crosshairs in here if you like to aim down sights to get even more crit chance on this build, which I'm sure also feels very neat. Just one thing I wouldn't recommend is go for Hornet Strike for even more base damage, because remember, with Secondary Encumber, we're likely gonna get over 1000% base damage bonus in the long run anyway, meaning Hornet Strike, relatively speaking, wouldn't make all too much of a difference. And the last build that I have right here is a little bit more of a creative one, where I go for Secondary Innovate to increase my crit chance, and I decided to mod for Blast because remember, we hit multiple enemies at the same time and Blast does work. Meaning we have a more damage over time focused build here, with of course Elementalist mod, Faction Damage mod, Blast modded onto the weapon itself, and a lot of multi-shot as well as fire rate. However, Secondary Innovate is of course not limited to a Blast build. You could naturally also put it on a build like this here. Just make sure if you put Secondary Innovate into here that you drop out your crit chance mod, because it essentially becomes useless then. And finally, before we end the video, I also wanted to give you a couple of suggestions for which loadouts might synergize nicely with the Dual Toxocyst. First of all, because this pistol is so headshot focused, it would be an absolute godsend in the hands of Harrow, given that naturally Harrow is the crit king when it comes to headshot builds. Then, in case you like to use Secondary Outburst for the massive crit boost, make sure to use some kind of melee that can easily sustain its own combo, either by going for Melee Crescendo to lock your combo multiplier at 12x no matter what, or something like the Ceramic Dagger Incarnon, which gets a lot of initial combo. But one thing you could also do is, if you have it, go for the Dex Nikana, because it only needs half the combo counter to get to its maximum combo multiplier, meaning it is very convenient to keep this one up at its maximum of 11x. And from tomorrow on, you get one last chance to unlock the Tomcat as well as the Attack and Luck from the Galleon of Ghouls event. So, if you want to see what these two melees are capable of, then definitely check out my guides on them right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Onakania 2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Damon, Shadow Lockhart, Troller Loxon, Kiski, Antares, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.